A grandma at the Dike. I used to live in the capital city of South Korea, called Seoul. Yet, my residence was in the most underdeveloped region compared to the urban areas of Seoul. Even today, the place is still seriously underdeveloped. It was in a worse condition in 1972 because of a disastrous flood that submerged the whole region underwater. My village had a large plain, slightly sloping and continuing to the west. Walking through the plain, I would see a steep, sunken place like a valley that led to a creek called Daebangcheon. There was a dike built to hold back the waters from flooding over. 50 or 60 shacks were clustered together near the dike. Shacks were easily seen throughout the town, but the residents near the dike were living like the homeless. They would pick up ragged clothes and their needs from garbage cans and streets. They were considered as scums of the town. Whenever I visited the dike, there was an indescribable stench. It was too repugnant. Not too far away was a building built to stand alone between the shacks and the village. It was my church where I ministered as a pastor. When the Great Flood came in 1972, most of the shacks were destroyed, swept away, and drowned underwater. The water even reached to the eaves of my church. The rain had finally stopped, and the water has drained out in 3 days. However, the flood left a devastating aftermath. The word hell was the most appropriate word to describe the place. The surrounding was full of filthy trash and disgusting foul matters that flooded from the upper village. If it weren't for the flood, then I would have seen a great harvest in autumn, the golden waves of harvest at the rice fields in front of the church. However, I only saw chaotic fields full of trash and soils that had become unusable for farming. It took a full week just to clean the sanctuary after the water had subsided. The residents at the shacks had scattered because of the flood damages, but they gathered again when the water had completely drained out. Wet blankets were being hung outside to dry, and their homes were rebuilt near the dike. It looked more pitiful and shabbier than before. In front of the church was a small stream that led to the creek called Daebangcheon. When I looked inside the stream near the church, dirty sewage water and trash were trapped. This waste was being sent from the upper village following the water current. This wasn't the only problem. The aftermath of the flood was terrible. Strong stench, flies, and millipede-like worms that formed because of the damp and humid area were filling up the stream and its surrounding areas. The rice and barley fields were dead. It turned into a dumping ground. Instead of farmers harvesting, the neighbors made a line with the wagons to dump out their excrement every dawn. I couldn't stand the smell. I fought with the shack's residents almost every day, trying to stop the neighborhood environment from getting worse. However, since they were only trying to survive, I couldn't really prevent the neighborhood from dumping more into the pitiful sight. Also, some of the shack residents attended my church. Thus, I couldn't oppose them for what they did. I thought my strong opposition could actually affect my church members, other unbelievers living in the shacks, and their views on church. I couldn't do much but to give up on this case. Thus, my church members and I had suffered much in return. When it rained, the church members had to walk on the road that was full of refuse in order to arrive at church. Due to the inconvenience, many church members stopped attending my church. They were also afraid of the flood coming back next year and encounter another disaster. Therefore, they hurriedly moved out of the area. As time passed, the muddy, filthy wayside turned into an asphalt-covered road. The stream has also been cleaned and recovered. Soon, tall apartments were built nearby. I also had torn down the old church building and constructed a new one. Because of a large gap between the sanctuary and ministry offices, the interior of the church seemed too neat and beautiful. But there was the tall apartment building that had now blocked the beautiful sunset in the west. I sometimes want to gaze upon the sunset in the west. Before the apartment buildings were constructed, the whole town used to bask in the sunset's radiance. When the sun reached the horizon, I was able to capture a beautiful glimpse of the setting sun. The sun seemed to close its eye as it disappeared below the horizon. I would stand in front of the church that was located in the middle of the field and enjoy the evening glow shine in the background. Because of its magnificent sight, I used to capture each moment with my camera. Unfortunately, I cannot find that scenery anywhere anymore today. One day, I simply looked up to the western sky. I saw an airplane fly by as if it were jumping from one building to another. Immediately, I remembered the grandma at the dike, and tears lingered in my eyes. No one knew her name. We all knew her as Mrs. Lee. She was about 80 years old, with a petite body, skinny face, and big eyes resembling a goldfish. Seeing her walk on the road with her back bent in 90 degrees reminded me of the Korean letter Kiyeok. She actually looked like the letter Kiyeok from far away. The neighbors and I used to call her Grandma at the Dike. She also was one of the residents of the shacks. She didn't have a son living with her, but she had an 18-year-old grandson. As the grandson worked from one factory to another, he met his girlfriend and soon gave birth to his child. The immature and young girlfriend had moved out somewhere after the flood. So the grandma began to take care of her great-grandson, who wasn't even 1 year old. She brought the baby to me and asked me to find ways to send her great-grandson off to a wealthy family for adoption. So I visited the Holt Children's Service Incorporated and the borough office to collect the documents needed for an adoption. Few days later, an American family adopted the grandma's great-grandson. On the day of the baby's departure to the United States, I went to Gimpo International Airport to send him off instead of the grandma. And when I returned home, the grandma was waiting for me. She had a wooden cane in her hand, leaning her body's weight on it. I informed her that the baby had left safely to the United States. Immediately, she dropped to the ground and began to cry out loud bitterly. Oh my! Her tears lingered in her eyes, but her weary, dried-up eyes could not shed any of them. She said to herself, "It must be your fate and destiny, so please don't blame anyone. Goodbye, baby." She continued to cry. The spring of 1978 was my first trip to the United States. On the day of my departure, the grandma was sitting on the church concrete floor, waiting for me. When she saw me, she waved her hand and called me over. She placed a 501, which paid for 4 meals at that time, bill in my hand. Use this for your trip. I know it isn't much, but please receive this as my appreciation for you. When you arrive in the United States, please try to look for my great-grandson before you return. I just responded, okay. On the day of my arrival from the States, the grandma was waiting for my return at the church. And her first word was, "Did you get to see my great-grandson?" I squatted to match her eye level and explained to her that the United States was indescribably large, that I couldn't tell what was where. She seemed to be very disappointed to hear that from me. She just sat there, wiping her teary eyes as she gazed upon the sky. Even after that day, she would ask me of her great-grandson's whereabouts whenever I traveled abroad. And every time I'd returned, I gave her nothing but just disappointments. Thus, she seemed to envy me for traveling abroad often and at the same time feel bitter for only delivering unsatisfactory answers. I am not sure when, but she stopped asking me to meet her great-grandson. I guess she gave up asking. Some time had passed by, and the neighbors told me that she stares at the airplanes in the sky until they disappear to the west. It wasn't just every now and then. I heard that she would stare at those airplanes flying many times throughout the day. Hearing that from the others, my heart ached with regrets as if I would cry tears of blood. Now, the streams are clean and fully recovered. The tall apartment buildings are constructed instead of shabby shacks by the dike. Things are now changing and developing. Yet, I don't know where the grandma at the dike is or how she is doing.